Good day everyone. I'm going to discuss the Philippines past revisited by Renato Constantino, Chapter 15. New Outposts and Preserve. The American conquest of the Philippines was a part of a pattern of expansion which dated almost from the establishment of 13 colonies. The course of empire began with the conquest of the American West, an undertaking which resulted in the decimation of the Indians and the liquidation of Spanish power in the Americans. Rationalizations and expansionism. Various justifications were given for expansionism. Some called it manifest destiny. Others, under the influence of social Darwinism, accepted it as the inevitable consequence of the inequality of races. Asians were brought in as a colony labor and subjected to many degrading legal and extra-legal restrictions premised on their supposed racial inferiority. Economic roots. The tide of expansionism that gripped America during this period was nothing more than the realization of the necessities of capitalist production, the imperative of expansion in the Latin America, and the need for a convenient base for the China trade were the propulsive factors for the American attack on the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. The Philippine Road. At this time, the big powers were engaged in the profitable business of dividing the Chinese melon among themselves. To be able to penetrate China economically and evangelistically, the United States had to have a base nearby. The Philippines was the answer. So for the second time, the island became a springboard to Asia. In search of a patron. The Filipino illustrators were aware of American interest in the Philippines. As early as 1897, the illustrators, eager to secure a foreign patron to underwrite their revolution, proposed that the United States send arms and ammunition to their government, pledging as security for payment to provinces and the custom house at Manila. The Catholic interest. The Catholic hierarchy in the United States also used its influence to encourage the American government to occupy the country. The Vatican wanted a treaty which would make it appear that the Philippines has been ceded to the United States by reason of purchase rather than conquest, so as to protect its title to its vast properties. Accordingly, the treaty in its final form stipulated the cession of the islands to the United States. The anti-imperialist. Although powerful economic, political, and even religious forces were in favor of the annexation of the Philippines, there was also much opposition to the move. The opponents of the annexation came to be called anti-imperialists. They did not oppose expansion but believed that such markets should not be obtained through outright occupation. They believed economic expansion without seizure of territory. It is clear therefore that the anti-imperialists that oppose Philippine colonization is not the same as the anti-imperialist that animates the national liberation movements in many underdeveloped nations today. The real debate. Political and administrative policies in the early years of occupation attempted to quiet the public clamor against colonization. The stringent censorship of news dispatches from the Philippines to conceal the first resistance of the Filipinos and their brutal suppressions by the American. The propaganda that the Filipinos in fact welcomed the American rule. Unfortunately, the imperialist propaganda offensive not only suited opponents at home, it was also accepted as a historical truth by several generations of miseducated Filipinos. A clash of interests. American economic policies in the Philippines represented a compromise between two clashing economic forces at home. Those interested in trade and economic holdings overseas supported colonization. Those interested in protecting local production and labor from foreign competition opposed colonization and subsequently agitated for early independence. Tough rule. The Filipinos would in future years consistently fail to perceive the selfish motives of many individuals and groups who supported their demands for independence, namely, hailing them as true friends of the Filipino people. One such personage is William Howard Taft, President of the Philippine Commission, Civil Governor, Secretary of War, and finally President of the United States. Filipino regarded him as their friend. Servicing American business. American investors had been pressuring the Taft Commission and presumably Washington, as well as to do something to open the Philippines for exploitation at the earliest possible time. Taft therefore urged the early establishment of civil government that could service impatient American businessmen could be established. On January 2, 1901, the Taft Commission sent an anxious wire of Secretary of War Eli Root, urgently recommending passage of the Spooner Bill. Spooner Bill is a rider to that Army Appropriation Bill, empowering the President of the United States instead of the military to administer the colony until such time as Congress could enact legislation setting up a permanent government. Spooner Amendment was the first legal step taken to formalize the colonization of the island. Philippines for Filipinos. Taft is gracefully remembered by many Filipinos for initiating the policy of the Philippines for Filipinos. Running the Philippines for Filipinos did not mean giving them independence or even autonomy. Taft saw the Philippines for Filipinos was good business. His goal was the enhancement of American economic control. Taft believed that the successful implementation of the policy of the Philippines for Filipinos would produce a nation of contented colonials who would not object to the permanent retention of their country by the United States. Philippine status clarified. While Filipinos were allegiance to the United States, they were not regarded as American citizens, and Congress could therefore enact special laws governing them, which did not affect American citizens. This meant the law protecting the home market from competition from Philippine products could be enacted. The American government thus satisfied its manufacturers and exporters on one hand, and its agricultural sector on the other hand, in both instances the expense of the Filipinos. The Copper Act, Protectionist Triumph. As anticipated in Spooner Amendment, the U.S. Congress subsequently got around to the business of providing an organic act for the colony. Philippine Bill of 1902, known as Copper Act, establishing the Philippine Assembly as the lower chamber of the bicameral legislature, whose upper house was the Philippine Commission. The Organic Act also empowered Philippine legislators to elect 2 resident commissioners to the United States. Act set acreage limit for individuals acquiring public land to only 16 hectares. Settling down to business. Assured of protection against competition from either cheap labor or cheap produce, the sector that had supported the anti-imperialist movement became reconciled to the annexation. The anti-imperialist movement soon died down. The furor regarding annexation over the Americans settling down to the business of exploiting their new colony in earnest. Shouldering the cost of exploitation. Exploitation of the colony involved development of the import-export trade and investment principally in the extract industries. These ventures required the developments of roads and railroads, as well as the enactment of legislation regarding trade between United States and the colony. The road building program was designed to satisfy the American needs. The money to build the roads was raised by taxing the Filipinos. Filipinos were shouldering the cost of the social improvements that would facilitate their own exploitation. As to add insult to the injury, American-oriented education would teach Filipinos to regard all these and more as benefits derived from the colonial rule. Eliminating competition. Before the American occupation, the Philippines had been trading with the other countries aside from Spain. Now that the United States government was in position to aid American traders and investors, it quickly proceeded to eliminate competition by enacting a series of tariff acts. Tariff Act of 1901 lowered the tariff rates on some types of American export to the Philippines. Tariff Act of 1902 reduced by 25% the duty on Philippine export to the United States and removed the tariff on American goods entering the Philippines. The Payne Aldrich Act. A few months after the Treaty of Paris restrictions lapsed, the United States Congress passed the Payne-Aldrich Act. Under this law, all American goods could enter the Philippines free of duty and in unlimited quantities. Friar lands and sugar investors. The Philippine Commission passed the Friar Land Act, which prescribed the conditions for the sale and lease of the friar estates, preference to be given to some 60,000 tenants who worked the land. The purchase of the friar haciendas was a shrewd political move designed to gain the goodwill of the Filipinos and thus help reconcile them to American sovereignty. The San Jose Estate Transaction. San Jose Estate are owned by Rich Corporation, the Sugar Trust. In 1914, Philippine Assembly enacted a law which included friar lands under the purview of public lands and therefore subject to the limitation of 16 hectares for an individual and 1,024 hectares for corporation. But the San Jose transaction was allowed to stand. Land policy. American land policy in the Philippines was conservative. Although the colonial government declared its desire to broaden the base of independent land ownership, American interests clearly lay in not disturbing the two policies cited. Titling drive. Individuals or corporations could acquire agricultural land. Poverty and ignorance, however, prevented small farmers from protecting their property by acquiring the necessary land titles. On the other hand, the landlords were able to legalize through the Torrens title even their claims to lands which they had usurped through fraudulent surveys and other means. Homestead Program encouraged the cultivation of hitherto uncultivated land. Homestead Program did not succeed without systematic government assistance. Poor tenants did not have the resources necessary to take advantage of the homestead offers. The triumph of American business. In 1900, the U.S. share in the total value of import-export trade of the Philippines was only 11%. By 1933, the figure had risen to 83%. A brief survey of the production and investment picture in the major agricultural exports will show the influx of American capital. In sugar, by 1922, the American Chamber of Commerce Journal listed 33 sugar centrals, most of them American and Spanish controlled. Copra. By 1935, 10 factories were supplying almost all the desiccated coconut being exported to the United States. 6 of these factories were Americans. The hemp bonanza. Hemp was principal export of the Philippines to United States until 1912. From 1920 to 1930, Philippines cordage export to the United States increased by over 500%. The Manila Americans. The Philippine-based American businessmen, whether they were in business for themselves or acting as agents for big American corporations, grew in wealth and power. Manila Americans took proprietary attitude toward the country, and all throughout the American occupation constituted one of the staunchest pressure groups against the Philippine independence. Consumption of habits. The influx of duty-free American goods drastically changed the consumption habits of the Filipino and introduced a buy stateside mentality with disastrous effect on local production. One notable example is the smoking habit of the Filipino. The transformation of consumption habits, which was characterized by a shift to American products, has been interpreted as a mark of modernization of Philippine society. Actually, it was merely part of the essential continuity in the evolving economic pattern that first became discernible in the 19th century. Do you agree or disagree with the analysis of the author? I agree with the analysis of the author. Americans didn't really help the Philippines. Instead, they just used the Philippines for their own sake. It's just that their propaganda accepted as a historical truth by several generations of these educated Filipinos. Their oriented education teaches Filipinos to regard all of their efforts to use the islands in Filipino people, and more as benefits derived from colonial rule. What is your personal analysis on this chapter content? American expansionism was driven because of the necessities of capitalist production. Philippines became a springboard to Asia because of its geographical location near to China. The motive of the American is not for the care of Filipino people. They did not give independence to the Philippines but used the islands for their own benefits. Instead of independence, they colonized the Philippines and grabbed all the opportunity to exploit Filipinos, grab lands, and grew their wealth and power. That's all. Thank you.